Welcome back, everyone. We're going to be picking up lecture from the comforts of my home, and hopefully yours too, or wherever you happen to be listening to this. I know this is unusual for us because, of course, there would be some more human contact in the sense that we would be able to do a question and answer. There will be some pauses during some of the lecture where I'll ask you to interact with what it is that we're seeing, and some also in relationship to the assigned reading. So it's always important to have done the assigned readings before lecture, and that way you can interact with those pauses as we would a regular class. At least that's the idea. So here we go. I'd like to begin actually with, as we take a look at the assigned reading here, the image on my desktop, I'd like to begin with a couple of observations about the reading and then ask you a few questions in relationship to some images. We see here in the reading for today by Graham and Richards, The Material Reality of State Power, that the regime, also sometimes referred to in the early years as the so-called Spanish Holocaust, the regime established concentration camps. We see here prisoners of war who have been put to work in labor camps. Their heads are shaved, or shaved tight, say like raised haircut, as other prisoners were at the time. They're also wearing a prisoner's uniform, and they're photographed before a nationalist symbol here. In other words, of fascism. It states that redemption for sentences through labor, or redemption or pardoning of sentences through work, in Spanish, la rendición de las penas por el trabajo. This might remind us actually of a separate context, something that we see in other fascist states or ideologies from World War II. Can you think of what this slogan has in common with those? Some of you may be familiar with this statement that was placed above the gates of Auschwitz and other work camps or death camps under the Nazi regime, that stated, "Work will set you free." And this is something that's very similar, actually, in the Spanish case, where we see that the redemption for sentences, "Work will set you free," is cast through a Catholic morality. In other words, it's not the question of work setting you free itself, but also that redemption, this notion of a spiritual, a Christian narrative of redemption itself or forgiveness. This is where we see the manifestation of fascism as what we refer to in Spanish, or rather in English, is national Catholicism. That is the union of a nationalist patria narrative with Catholicism or Catholic morality. This is an example of how the Spanish fascist interpretation of the fascist ideology ultimately is seen through a Catholic morality. If we move down, then we can also see this image here. The regime had historians that would rewrite the history of Spain through the ideology of the regime and through the ideology of national Catholicism. This went hand in hand in the early 40s with a purging of professors from university studies, where if professors' ideologies weren't in line with the new social order, with fascism or with the dictatorship, then they were subject to repression, or even simply being eliminated from their jobs. And so we see then that universities were stacked with Franco sympathizers. Such is the case too with the historians of the regime. We see that educational curricula are rewritten from primary school, secondary school, and of course academic studies beyond in the university, to be able to show Spanish history through the fascist ideology. This is an example. Here we have a children's book on Saint Teresa. This dates to 1955. Santa Teresa, however, Santa Teresa de Jesus, is a figure from the 1500s. She's a saint and the founder of a religious order, the Carmelite order. She was also an author. She wrote her autobiography and is the founder of the mystic order, ultimately, or mysticism, is one of the main central figures of Spanish mysticism from the height of empire, the Baroque period. Um, Saint Teresa is a powerful woman. She is historically a doctor of the church and very well educated, and stands out for her time because she's a doctor of the church at a time when women did not have access to superior studies. And at this time, we see then that the 1955, the regime rewrites her figure in this role. In what ways do you see the representation, the image of Santa Teresa that we have before us in reference to the reading for today, Martin Gaite? I'll pause for a moment here. We see her sewing at home. She's stitching or sewing. She's in a domestic sphere. She's in a domestic scene. And we see her with a box of a sewing kit with needles and so on. What's unusual about this is that we see her recast through the gendered role of a maternal, if not maternal, caregiving and in domestic woman from the 1950s under the regime. And yet we don't see in any way that she was an empowered woman, that she was educated. We don't see books, for example. And if you allow me to make a crack, it's to add insult to injury. We see that they've even recasted her as a cat lady, with a with a cat in the lower left hand corner. In other words, we see that the figure of Saint Teresa, of her power and her controversy, had been stripped away, and instead she's shown through the ideology of ideal gender roles of the regime in the 1950s. My question to you, also for pause in your notes, in what ways was poverty criminalized under the regime? In what ways were women and also working class men criminalized or cast as criminals under the regime? I'd like to then turn our attentions to this image here. Immediately after the war, the regime begins to rebuild amid a shortage of resources. It begins to rebuild a devastated landscape in not only Madrid but elsewhere. We certainly see this behind the dictator Figueres Center. This is University City in Madrid that's been demolished or destroyed from the war. It was one of the areas of the city most destroyed during the war. And in the background, we see the Telefonica building towering in the back. It was actually one of the surviving buildings of downtown Madrid. It was never hit by bombs. Um, and then in the foreground, we have the figure of the dictator who is central here. His hand is up in the air, giving the fascist salute. It says Madrid in the eyes and in the soul. Madrid en los ojos y en el alma. And then below it, we see a statement which is equivalent to, say, seeing Hail Hitler. It's Arriba España, which literally means up with Spain. But it's equivalent, say, with a connotation here of hearing, say, a hail. We also see in the upper left-hand corner Spanish soldier, soldado español. And in this image, collage of images, we have a picture, or rather a multifaceted picture, of gender roles, of the new roles for women, new roles for men in this society, and also children. And so my question to you in the next few minutes is, in what ways do you observe in these many different images the new social order under the regime? While we do this, I'm actually going to play a song from the same time period of the 1940s called Tatuaje, Tattoo. We'll get back to that in a moment, but let me put it on. It is exactly the amount of time that you'll have to be able to write this down, say 3 minutes.
Hay expertos en salto de longitud y luego están los expertos en saltar canciones. Para los segundos tenemos la solución perfecta. Spotify Premium. Sáltate todos los temas que quieras y disfruta de tu música favorita sin interrupciones. Toca en el banner para obtener más información.
After this commercial announcement.
Él vino en un barco de nombre extranjero, lo encontré en el puerto un anochecer, cuando el blanco faro sobre los veleros su beso de plata dejaba caer. Era hermoso y rubio como la cerveza, el pecho tatuado con un corazón, y en su voz amarga había la tristeza doliente y cansada del acordeón. Y ante 2 copas de aguardiente sobre el manchado mostrador, él fue contándome entre dientes la vieja historia de su amor. Mira mi brazo tatuado con este nombre de mujer, es el recuerdo de un pasado que nunca más ha de volver. Ella me quiso y me ha olvidado, en cambio yo no la olvidé, y para siempre voy marcado con este nombre de mujer. Él se fue una tarde con rumbo ignorado en el mismo barco que lo trajo a mí, pero entre mis labios se dejó olvidado un beso de amante que yo le pedí. Errante lo busco por todos los puertos, a los marineros pregunto por él, y nadie me dice si está vivo o muerto, y sigo en mi duda buscándolo fiel, y voy sangrando lentamente de mostrador en mostrador ante una copa de aguardiente donde se ahoga mi dolor. Escúchame, marinero, y dime qué sabes de él. Era gallardo y altanero, y era más rubio que la miel. Mira su nombre de extranjero, escrito aquí sobre mi piel. Si te lo encuentras, marinero, dile que yo muero por él.
Okay. So what we see here are several images. Yes, I think we're done seeing Conchita Piquer. We'll come back to you in a minute. What we see here are several images grafted into one that communicate in this form of propaganda issued by the regime the new social order. We see, in other words, that central to this is the figure of the dictator. And he's giving unabashedly the fascist salute. And to the right, we see his name repeated 3 times, Franco, 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 like a chant. The cult of the dictator as figurehead, and as paternalist figure of society is certainly at play. In fact, we see this too in the language of the dictator through his death, even up until his death in 1975. His public speeches from 1939 to 1975 would often begin with the term "españoles mis hijos," my children, Spaniards, my children, referring to himself as the paternal figure, as the father figure of all Spaniards. Keep in mind, that the regime would put forth newsreels that would showcase the dictator as an ideal father figure for the nation, but also literally in his intimate life with his wife Carmen Polo and their daughter Carmencita. In other words, we see the role of the Spanish family, very specifically heterosexual model with father as head of household, be reinforced in this form of heteropatriarchy ultimately, or paternalist order. And then, of course, within that, we see that men are mobilized as soldiers in defense of the nation. We see all of the men around portrayed in one way or another wearing military regalia, or being young boys being trained, as we see in the lower left-hand corner, to become military men. Or we see then women mobilized as secondary roles in supporting roles. In the upper right-hand corner, the military man giving the fascist salute is flanked by two women who are nurses. Those nurses are dressed in a Catholic, in a uniform as nurses, but also in a habit, which is what nuns wear. And then we also see them in camaraderie, which is also in what we see for the reading for today, these four women at the very top. Next to them, sewing. Below to the left, then also cooking, caregiving for children. In other words, always mobilized within a very specific gendered role. Children, too, are trained to be religious, pious. We see them praying before a meal, or even young girls dressed in a uniform like nuns. And within this narrative, there's a question of remembrance for the sacrifices to the nation or for the nation. That's what we see in the grave site in the lower right-hand corner. There's a wreath being laid down before a grave of a Christian cross. In other words, it reinforces this idea of patria, or patriotism, nation, and also Catholic morality, Catholicism, again, national Catholicism. That would be the manifestation of fascism in Spain. In the reading for today, we see that Carmen Marti Gaite narrates her own experience wanting to go to college as a woman during the Francoist years, late Francoism actually, and she explains to us her own first-person experience, or rather, the essay today is informed by her own first-person experience of what it was like for women who wanted to get any kind of a license, belong to any kind of a cultural association, travel with a passport, or even work and find work, or even go to pursue studies in college and university. These women were required to give 18 months of social service in the Sección Femenina, the women's chapter of the Falange, or the Fascist Party. And my question to you is, what did women teach one another in these classes? What kinds of classes were women to take, and what kinds of classes did they teach? I'll also suggest that you have in your notes, or take a few moments and just jot down the following. In what ways do these classes suggest a certain social role for women, or try to reinforce a certain social role for women? And then what is that role? We see that the leader of the Falange, Pilar Primo de Rivera, is the sister of the founder of the fascist party, José Antonio Primo de Rivera, who actually, up until very recently, was buried. His remains were buried alongside Franco in the Valley of the Fallen, in Valle de los Caídos, which was built by concentration camp labor. We see that women then in the Sección Femenina were mobilized specifically as subordinates to men. This formed part of the ideological project of the regime. And we understand, too, that this is a reversal of some of the rights and forms of equality that were attempted to be put forth in some of the laws of the Second Republic. So Laws such as the legalization of contraception were overturned. Divorce was also made illegal, which is one of the laws of the Second Republic. And so too were women reduced to a subordinate role to men. They could not travel or obtain a passport without a husband or some kind of male chaperone or, let's say, guardian. Nor could they open a bank account or engage in any kind of financial or banking transaction without a male co-signer. In difference to 19th century gender roles, however, the sección femenina and Spanish fascism and its role for women was not exclusively a domestic role. In other words, it mobilized women to go into the public. It mobilized women to go into the public to teach other women and to ultimately monitor other women, to inculcate or propagate this message in some of the fascist ideology and the gender roles for women. In other words, it mobilized women to police other women, as Helen Graham, our author for today, mentions, is a historian and expert on the regime. Okay, I'd like to return then to some of the slides that we didn't get a chance to get to the other day, encouraging you to take a look at your notes and incorporate a given quote from today's reading and Martin Gaite's experience, and include in that experience or including your notes a segment that you that called your attention for whatever reason. In other words, a quote that's from the reading about women that called your attention, and then a brief reaction to it. Just go ahead and jot down why you chose this quote and what you think about it. I find this to be usually one of the most animated class discussions because people find the comments made by the ideologues of the regime about women or even from women in trying to preach subordinates of women from women's positions to be some of the most egregious material for that students react to without that doesn't leave them without a judgment, basically. So the review that I wanted to get to is in relationship to our former reading by Giles Tremlett, Los Secretos a Voces. The reading of Tremlett, which discusses the three Republican women's, the mass grave with their bodies, and the exhumation process to give them a proper burial, as being a controversial one. And now I'd like to address that in greater detail, but the Law of Historical Memory of 2007 comes about, and it's referenced in the reading, comes about as an initiative from the political left, the establishment left, the Partido Socialista Obrero Español, which will abbreviate the Spanish Socialist Party by calling them the PSOE, as they're referred to here, the PSOE in red. And this is the political left wing, establishment left wing. And the law of historical memory was opposed by the Partido Popular, which is the establishment right-wing party. The Partido Popular, which we'll refer to as the PP, by their initials, which is the blue. The law stipulates the following things: that the state will provide certain funding sources and assistance in order to resolve or reach some kind of resolution about the past. First and foremost, in the prologue, or the preamble actually, to the law, it stipulates that the repression of the Francoist dictatorship was wrong, and it condemns the violence of the Franco dictatorship as reprehensible. It's the first time in 2007 that written into a law, written into the language of the state, or the discourse of the state, there is an outright rejection of the Francoist past. This is an important point we're going to come back to in a future class. Why is it that it would take so long? Why is it that it would be till 2007 and not in time with the transition, not, say, a generation prior, in step with the transition from the dictatorship and his death in 1975 into the early democratic years of the 1980s? Why would it take a generation later? That's an open question we'll return to. Another state provision guarantees state funding to assist in the exhumation of those mass graves that are unresolved, the identification of human remains via forensics, and today advanced DNA testing. Um, and then also, what's probably affected a great number of people more than any other initiative is that the state is required through the Ministry of Justice to release all public records that it has on a local, regional, or national level about a given relative. In other words, the disappearance of that relative, their trial, assassination, incarceration, or otherwise. In other words, it's a full public divulging of information for transparency of what happened to your relatives. If you happen to know from if you happen to know from family histories what happened, well, this is an opportunity to be able to file an official disclosure of public record. And many families did so to find out the actual years, the ways in which family members were condemned or tried, and so on. Remember, of course, after the war, Spain became a country of immigrants. Many went to France, many went to the United States or elsewhere in the Americas, including Mexico and the Spanish-speaking world, later Bolivia, and so on. In other words, this would allow citizenship to be granted to those families who were exiled, or rather the descendants of those who were exiled. The state then also stipulates that all symbols and monuments that praise fascism or Francoism in some way should be taken down. Now, what's interesting about this is that this isn't always enforced. There are countless cases on a local level where we see that there are symbols or monuments that praise the dictatorship or that praise fascism that haven't been taken down. And the reason as to why they haven't been taken down is actually quite complicated. In some places, like in Cuenca, the Catholic Church has stalled or resisted being compliant with the law. And so it's become a political issue because the church is not honoring the law if it has, say, a monument on the corner or on the side of on its wall. And then we see that there's a political struggle to be able to have them enforce the law. The reason why, another reason why we have Francoist monuments and symbols around is sometimes it's a question of jurisdiction. Whose property is it? Is it the church property? Who then is required to actually to honor the law, but it becomes more sticky to enforce that? Or is it in the center of a public plaza where it's clear that it should be taken down, but who is the ruling party in power? If it's of this political left, then they're in favor usually of supporting the law or of enforcing the law. If it's the political right, however, such as the Partido Popular, we see that it's not always enforced. And that's something that we see at odds, at issue in, say, Madrid, where there are still residual Francoist monuments that need to be taken down but haven't so far. So, what to do with the Valley of the Fallen? The Valley of the Fallen, the dictator's own grave, gets its own clause in the law. A special commission was established to determine what should be done. And that commission said that the findings of that commission after this law was passed published their report stating that Franco's remains, the dictator's remains, should be exhumed and buried in a private plot as he was last fall. But then that the monument itself should be turned into a memory museum, and that will be a much larger task that may or may not take place within our lifetime, because there are also some estimated 33 to 35,000 human remains that also need to be identified before that were to happen. Okay, so what are some of the problems then with this? Well, we see that there's an uneven application of the law. Depending on where you are, the law of historical memory might be enforced, it might not be, depending on who's in power. It might be, too, a question of whose property is it. Then another question, too, is that over time, we see that increasingly some younger generations don't necessarily have a memory of what the past was unless it's been something that formed part of their studies, The war itself and the political repression of Francoism does not always appear in obligatory curriculum for education. Or if it does, it appears in a very matter-of-fact way. In other words, it gives us the sense that it still is a very touchy issue, and that there are very personal memories and family narratives about what the war was that students will be very familiar with from, say, their grandparents or great-grandparents. So over time, it becomes a question of that maybe certain segments of society seem that it's what's its relevance. How is this really important or even relevant today? And so it becomes a question of forgetting or even of historical amnesia about this circumstance. And we see that some of our unresolved political issues in Spain today could be understood but to be in direct linkage to the lack of public conversation or collective conversation about the Francoist past or about the Civil War. In other words, the rise of the extreme right, it could be argued, is the result of a kind of historical amnesia about what the Francoist dictatorship was here. Here's the Valley of the Fallen. The Valley of the Fallen was built with concentration camp labor. They were political prisoners, usually Republican-leaning prisoners of war, or sometimes anarchists and otherwise, who were held, like we saw in the photograph, and were forced into labor. Many of whom died building this, but the records of exactly how many are shady, because of course, as we can imagine, the records aren't always reliable or didn't even survive. So we only have a partial picture of what the building of this monument was, but ultimately it required dynamiting or blasting a tunnel that pierces the interior of this monument and traverses it to the other side. And on one side you have a monastery that continues to operate today as church property. And on this side, you have the basilica, also church property, but the entrance into what are really like the catacombs and chapel where the dictator is buried alongside the founder of the Spanish Fascist Party, José Antonio Primo de Rivera and Francisco Franco. Flanking either side of the monument, you see a haloed eagle, which is the imperial symbol from the Spanish Empire that's been reappropriated in Spanish fascism. And above the main door, this monumental statue of the Virgin Mary mourning the Christ figure who's been taken down from the cross upon his death after crucifixion. And we're going to return to those images in a future class. We see, though, that the rotunda and the style of this architecture itself, not only its monumentality, but its austere style with little ornamentation and size were plans that were taken directly from the Nazi architect Albert Speer, who visited Spain in 1939 and in the early 40s to assist in the rebuilding of Franco's Spain as a gift from Hitler's administration. So, revisiting some of those Francoist symbols, what do you see here? I'd like to give you a couple of minutes to write down some of the observations that you have to analyze how this is a symbol of fascism. Go ahead. Okay, so we see that the haloed eagle is actually a symbol of, taken from the height of empire. It's a symbol, if you remember from Toledo, that actually dates to Ferdinand and Isabel. Ferdinand and Isabel, the Catholic monarchs, whose marriage is, within this national narrative, understood to be the beginning of the consolidation of Spain as a unified territory, so to speak. The fascist interpretation of these imperial symbols, though, is one that picks up the haloed eagle as a nostalgic return to an empire that had been lost. That forms part of the nationalist, national Catholic discourse in Spain from the dictatorship years. Below, we see a slogan that was the dictatorship slogan: one, great, and free. Spain was one, unified, Castilian speaking only, centralized in a Madrid administration without the federal system, right, that we had studied from the Republic. Two, Spain is great, that Spain had returned to the grandeur, or could be returned to the grandeur of an empire that had been lost. And three, Spain is free, not free, of course, in any sense of liberty, but that it was free of its enemies. And this is the idea of how the regime established itself as a stamping out of democracy, military rule that stamped out the republic as though it were a mistake or a historical error, so to speak. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to mention then, going back to this, is why is it that women would be enticed to join the sección femenina? We might look back in hindsight and see the early years of Francoism and fascism in Spain as an abomination, an atrocity, many other things. There are many other words that we could use to describe an ethical concern for the forms of political repression that were taking place. But we also then would be forgetting why fascism was appealing. And part of this, we understand, is that women in limited social roles were mobilized to go into the public with a specific instrumental role at the service of the nation. This was appealing for many women. It was a social outlet, and it was also, for many working class women in particular, the only way to pursue studies of a social class of women who didn't perceive college or university or superior studies as an option. And so this actually was appealing for many women. And we should keep that in mind. We should keep it in mind in the sense that fascism can easily be viewed as a monstrosity or in other terms, and yet we have to understand that it really, there was a following for it. There was an appeal, a popular mass appeal for it. And without that, we tend to forget exactly why it was that fascism was successful in mobilizing the masses. Lastly, I'd like to go back to our song Tatuaje. Tatuaje from Conchita Piquer, or Concha Piquer. Concha Piquer is a copla singer from the 1930s and 40s. This song that we've been listening to was considered to be a resistance song for women. Resistance in the sense that it sings the song of a woman who's in love with a sailor who she met in a tavern one evening, and she has an amorous relationship with him, and he continues on his way, and she's forever mourning the loss of the love of her life. And then at the end of the song, we understand that she is repeating the same chorus that the sailor repeated to her, that she has lost her own love interest, and she's tattooed his name on her arm. What's interesting about this is that it shows how there were also forms or cultural forms that women upheld as a sign of, in a sense, resistance to the regime. My question to you is, why would this narrative, why would this song be appealing as a kind of resistance to the regime?
Él vino en un barco de nombre extranjero, lo encontré en el puerto un anochecer, cuando el blanco faro sobre los veleros.
And that's today's lecture. See you next time. Thank you very much.
Dejaba caer, era hermoso. como soy rubio como la